My name is Laila, and I still find it hard to understand how I went from living in a palace surrounded by luxury to being here, telling this story. I grew up among cold marble columns and silk fabrics that shimmered under the Saudi Arabian sun. But inside, I felt like I was suffocating. In my home, religion was not an option. It was the air you breathed, a rigid discipline that allowed for not even a single breath of doubt. They called me the obedient daughter because I knew how to recite the Quran perfectly, moving my lips with mechanical precision while my mind wandered to places even I didn't know. The silence in those hallways was heavy, laden with expectations that I fulfilled without a word until that Ramadan dawn arrived and changed everything. I wasn't looking for a revolution. I just wanted some real silence, away from prying eyes, and I ended up entering the old library, a place full of dust and shadows where time seemed to have stopped centuries ago among shelves of dark, heavy wood. Before continuing, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any testimony, and leave in the comments where you are listening from. It is very important to have you participating in this community. Now, let's get back to the testimony. I was looking through some old books, searching for nothing in particular, when my fingers brushed a spine that felt different, something smaller and more worn than the large volumes of family history. When I pulled it out and saw it was a Bible in English, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the ground beneath my feet had suddenly vibrated. I knew perfectly well that having that in my hands was a sentence, something forbidden that could destroy my life in a second if someone walked through that door. My heart pounded against my chest so hard I thought the guards in the hallway could hear it. But even so, I couldn't let it go. There was something about that book, a kind of invisible magnet that forced me to press it against my tunic to hide it from anyone's sight. I took it to my room trembling, feeling the weight of every step, and hid it under my bed, convinced that I had just brought a fire into my own room, a secret that burned hotter than the desert sun outside. That night, when the entire palace fell silent, I took out the book and turned on my cell phone light to read a little, with fear stuck in my throat. I began to turn the pages with numb fingers, expecting to find words of hate or something that justified everything I had always been told about that book. But what I found left me paralyzed. I started reading about a man named Jesus who spoke of forgiveness, who looked at the marginalized with a tenderness I had never experienced in my religious life. He wasn't a distant judge, only looking for errors to punish, but someone who seemed to understand me better than my own family. My eyes filled with tears without me being able to help it, and for the first time, I felt that my prayers were not empty repetitions to fulfill a ritual, but a real conversation with someone who was right there, listening to my silent sobs. That dawn, the structure of my world began to crack, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again, even if I had to pretend before everyone. The days that followed were a constant torture of pretense because I felt my face betrayed me at every moment of the day. I tried to go on with my routines, but my legs shook during the mandatory prayers, and my mind remained trapped in the phrases of hope I had read the night before under the covers. I began to notice things I had completely ignored before, like the cracked hands of the servants who cleaned my room or the infinite exhaustion in the eyes of the guards who followed me everywhere. A strange, almost painful compassion settled in my chest and made me want to tell them about this God who called me daughter instead of servant. My family began to look at me differently, with a silent suspicion that felt like a net tightening around me more and more. I knew I was walking on the edge of an abyss and that any slip would make me fall, but the hunger I felt to keep reading that book was much stronger than the atrocious fear I felt of being discovered. The tension reached its peak one hot afternoon while we were gathered in the main hall, a vast space where every whisper seemed to bounce off the marble walls. My father read passages from the Quran with that authoritative voice that had always made me lower my head, speaking about the punishment for the disobedient and the need for absolute submission before the faith. I was sitting there, trying to maintain my composure, but my mind repeated over and over the words that gave me comfort. Jesus, help me understand this. Give me your peace right now. Without realizing it, what was an internal cry escaped my lips in a barely audible murmur, a tiny spark of voice that broke the heavy rhythm of the family reading. My uncle, who had always been the strictest religious advisor, turned his face toward me with a slowness that chilled the blood in my veins. His small, dark eyes pierced me, seeking to confirm what he had just heard. The air became thick, almost impossible to breathe, and I knew in that instant that the veil of my protection had been broken forever before them. From that day on, the palace ceased to be my home and became a cage where every shadow seemed to have eyes and ears that followed me everywhere on the premises. The surveillance became suffocating. The guards no longer greeted me with the usual respect, but stayed still, observing my every move with a distrust that made my chest ache. The worst was when my favorite servant, the one who had cared for me since I was a teenager and in whom I confided my most intimate sorrows, was suddenly replaced by an unknown woman with a glacial gaze who didn't say a single word. They searched my things every time I left the room, rummaging through my drawers and tunics with an aggressiveness that would have been unthinkable for someone of my position before. I walked through the hallways, feeling the ground open beneath my feet, with the constant sensation that something terrible was about to explode. But even so, the comfort I found in those forbidden readings was the only thing that kept me standing. The night everything collapsed was one of the darkest I remember, with a silence that felt like a warning before the definitive storm over my life. I was kneeling on the floor of my room, on the prayer rug, but I wasn't reciting the usual verses. Instead, I had the Bible open on my legs, feeling the paper beneath my fingers. I was using the dim light of my cell phone, with the brightness at its lowest to avoid drawing attention, immersed in the words of the Gospel of John that spoke of the light that shines in the darkness. Suddenly, I heard an almost imperceptible creak in the wood of the door, a sound so soft that for a second I thought it was just my imagination playing a joke on me. Looking up, I saw Fatima, the new servant, standing in the doorway, staring at me with an expression I cannot forget. She didn't scream, nor did she reproach me at that moment. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on the forbidden book that I tried uselessly to cover with my hands. Not even 30 minutes passed before the palace transformed into a scene of chaos and screams that echoed through all the marble galleries of the property. I could hear the heavy thud of the guards' boots coming up the stairs and my father's voice calling my name with a fury I had never heard from him before, a voice that no longer contained paternal love. When my bedroom door was kicked down with a violent bang that made me jump, I didn't move. I remained there, kneeling, hugging the Bible against my chest as if it were my only shield in the midst of the disaster. My father entered first, his face distorted by disappointment and hate, followed by my uncle and my brother, who looked at me as if I were a stranger, a monster that had just appeared in their house. In that moment of pure terror, I had the chance to lie or say it was an unimportant mistake, but something inside me gave me supernatural strength. I looked my father in the eyes, and with a firm voice told him that I believed in Jesus and in every word of that book. The silence that followed my confession was heavier than any scream I could imagine at that moment. My father looked at me as if I had just killed him inside, and the hatred in my uncle's eyes was something palpable, almost like a physical flame burning the air between us. The sentence was pronounced right there, without any formal trial, without the right to defense or any kind of logical explanation. My uncle, citing verses I had known since infancy with a frightening firmness, declared that I had committed apostasy, the most serious crime of all, which forever stained the blood of our royal lineage. The decision was brutal and immediate. I would be burned alive in 2 days, in the inner courtyard of the palace, before all the relatives and important members of the court, to serve as an example that no one was above the spiritual laws of the kingdom. My father merely nodded his head, a cold gesture that cut the last bond of hope I still held regarding his love, leaving me completely surrendered to a fate of absolute horror. I was dragged by the guards through those corridors I knew inch by inch, where I spent my entire childhood running with my cousins under the watchful eyes of the nannies. Every detail of the walls, the golden mosaics, and the smell of expensive incense now seemed to mock my misfortune as my feet were dragged across the stone floor without ceremony. I was thrown into a dark cell in the basement, a place where sunlight never reached, and the air was heavy with the suffocating smell of mold, dirt, and decades of accumulated humidity. The floor was terribly cold and rough against my skin, and the only thing they gave me to spend the nights was an old, damp blanket that smelled of sweat and total abandonment. In that tiny, somber cubicle, I could clearly hear the sound of my own racing breath, feeling that the palace that was once my safe home had now become my silent tomb, while time began to run implacably toward the end. I spent the next 48 hours in that dark hole, completely losing track of when it was day or night in the world outside. Every now and then, a guard would pass through the hallway and bang hard on the iron bars, just to wake me from the little sleep I had, or to call me horrible names, treating me as if I were an infected animal. I received only a piece of dry bread and a little water that seemed to have come from some forgotten and dirty well. But hunger and thirst were the least of my problems compared to the spiritual weight I felt crushing my chest. I prayed without ceasing, not with the memorized words I had been taught all my life, but with a bleeding heart before Jesus, asking that he would not let me waver in the moment of extreme physical pain. The silence of the cell was broken only by the sound of rats running in the corners and by my own contained weeping, as I tried to cling to every promise of love I had read in that forbidden Bible before being captured. On the morning preceding the execution, I received an unexpected visit from my mother, but she didn't even have the courage to enter the cell to hug me one last time. She stood on the other side of the bars, her face completely covered by the veil, but I could perfectly hear the sound of her desperate sobs as she begged me to deny everything I had said. She said, between tears, that we could pretend it was temporary madness, that the king might have mercy if I made a public retraction in the name of our family's honor, but I felt that my soul already belonged elsewhere. When I said, with total clarity, that I could not deny the truth I had found in Jesus, her crying stopped instantly, replaced by a cutting coldness that chilled my soul. She lifted her head and, with a voice devoid of any human emotion, said that from that moment on, I was no longer her daughter, and that she would watch my death with the relief of someone removing a malignant tumor from their own life. The dawn of the execution was the longest and most silent period I have ever lived in my entire existence, where time seemed to have frozen on that stone floor. I couldn't sleep a wink, not out of fear of dying, though dread was lurking there, but because I felt a desperate need to talk to God one last time. I didn't use ready-made formulas. I simply poured my soul out before Jesus, asking that if the flames had to consume me, he would be there holding my hand. What scared me most was the total absence of hysterical panic. I expected to be screaming or trying to tear at the bars, but instead, a strange and deep peace began to fill the void of that dark cell. I cried in silence, feeling the weight of my mother's rejection, but at the same time, I realized I was not alone in that filthy cubicle, as if an invisible presence were embracing me in the dark. It was a certainty that didn't come from me, but from something much greater than any pain. When the guards finally arrived, the sky still had that dark blue tone that precedes dawn, and the sound of boots in the hallway sounded like the rhythm of a funeral drum. They threw open the cell with a bang and tossed a white tunic of fine linen at my feet, the traditional symbol indicating repentance and a return to the family faith. I looked at that piece of clothing, and for the first time in those 48 hours, I felt a courage that made me lift my chin before those armed and brutal men. I refused the tunic with a firm gesture, saying I preferred to go to my death in the clothes I was already wearing, the clothes of who I truly was now. If I was going to die because of Jesus, I wanted to die as Laila, the woman he set free, and not as the princess molded by the whims and traditions of a system that only knew fear. They didn't argue. They just grabbed me by the arms with unnecessary force, lifting me from the cold floor and dragging me out of that cell to face what was coming. Walking through those palace corridors one last time was like revisiting the ghosts of a life that no longer belonged to me, where every turn brought a painful memory. I passed the reading room where, years ago, I sat to memorize sacred texts without understanding anything, and the marble balcony where I used to watch the sunset with my cousins. Everything seemed strangely distant and dull, as if I were seeing the world through a veil of smoke even before the fire began. The guards said nothing. Only the metallic sound of weapons and the constant thud of footsteps echoed through the luxurious galleries that now served as the hallway to my sacrifice. I felt small before that immensity of gold and stone, but strangely focused on what was to come, as if every step brought me closer to a freedom that no one there could take from me. Upon crossing the last portal that led to the inner courtyard, the fresh morning air hit my face, bringing with it the metallic smell of dust and the silence of hundreds of people waiting for my death. The inner courtyard was transformed into a stage of silent horror, with a crowd of familiar faces avoiding my gaze as I was led to the center. In the middle of the open space, a rough wooden post was driven into the ground, surrounded by piles of firewood shimmering with the oil and gasoline that had been poured there. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of fuel and dry desert air that caused immediate nausea, making my stomach churn as I was tied up. The rough fiber ropes tightened around my wrists and ankles against the wood, cutting off circulation and leaving me in a vulnerable position before all those spectators. I saw my father and my uncle sitting in a raised area, with expressions oscillating between religious authority and a pain they tried to hide at all costs behind their long beards. The sunlight was beginning to hit the top of the palace walls, and I knew those would be the last rays of light I would see on this earth before the fire transformed everything into ashes and definitive silence. My father rose from his seat and walked slowly toward me, stopping a few meters from the post where I was tied humiliatingly before everyone. His voice was visibly choked, laden with a suffering he desperately tried to stifle with his royal authority, but his eyes showed a weakness I had never seen before in that strong man. He gave me one last opportunity, begging in a whisper that barely came out for me to just say I repented, that all of it had been just a lapse in judgment or a passing confusion of my young mind. A single word, a positive nod, and the ropes would be cut immediately, and my life would be spared before the entire kingdom watching my trial. I looked him deeply in the eyes, feeling an immense love for that man who gave me life, but I realized there was no turning back from the truth I had discovered in those pages. With the clearest and firmest voice I could muster, I told him I loved him very much, but that I could not deny Jesus, the only one who truly knew me entirely. He wavered for a second. I saw his face tremble with pain, but then he took a step back and nodded to the executioner, allowing the death ritual to continue without further interruption. The silence that followed that final gesture was suffocating, broken only by the sound of the wind blowing softly between the palace's marble columns and the distant song of some birds unaware of the horror about to happen. The religious leader began to recite the verses that justified my punishment, his voice echoing in a rhythmic, heavy, and hypnotic way. But I could no longer focus on anything he said. Everything around me suddenly seemed muffled, as if I were submerged in deep and silent waters, and the only thing pounding hard in my mind was the name of Jesus, repeated like a mantra of absolute spiritual survival. When the lit torch finally touched the oil-soaked wood, the fire rose with a terrifying roar, an explosion of violent heat that licked my feet and climbed rapidly up my legs like a hungry beast. The pain was instantaneous, searing, and terrible, something human words cannot accurately describe. A fire that seemed to devour not just my flesh and my clothes, but my very soul. At the height of physical agony, when I felt my body could not endure another second of that torture, I screamed with all the strength left in my lungs, "Jesus, save me." It was exactly at that moment of total surrender and human despair that something absolutely impossible and supernatural happened before hundreds of witnesses observing my imminent end. A light of an intensity I had never seen or even imagined in life erupted from within the flames, swallowing the entire courtyard with a glow that was not of fire, but something pure, clean, and extremely alive. It wasn't a glow that burned the skin or caused blindness, but a magnificent clarity that brought with it an immediate supernatural peace, making all the pain disappear from one second to the next, as if it had never existed in my body. At the very center of that light, I didn't just see a mental image. I felt a real, physical, and powerful presence that manifested before me with a love that no human being in this world could offer. I saw Jesus in a way I cannot explain, clearly noticing the marks in his hands, and the gaze of deep compassion that seemed to heal every emotional and physical wound of my being in that moment. I felt the rough ropes binding me to the post simply melt and fall onto the ground of ashes, leaving me completely loose in the middle of the furnace that still roared around me but no longer touched me. When the indescribable light began to diminish and the smoke cleared slightly, the scene that remained in the palace courtyard was one of such profound shock that no one could move or emit a single sound. I was there, standing in the exact center where the fire should have reduced me to ashes, with my clothes only slightly scorched, but my body was totally intact, without any burn, blister, or sign of pain. My arms, which before were tied and wounded by the violent pressure of the fiber ropes, were now free and perfectly healthy, as if I had just woken up from a peaceful sleep and not from a cruel public execution. I looked around and saw faces of absolute terror and incredulity. Guards who were once brave were now pale, trembling, and paralyzed. Some even fallen on their knees, with their hands over their faces in a sign of dread. My father was on the ground, his head between his hands and his eyes fixed on nothing, as if he had lost the capacity to process what he was seeing, while my uncle leaned against a column, white as paper, murmuring disjointed words about witchcraft. I was the only person who felt total peace in the midst of that chaos of amazement. It was then that I heard that voice again, but it wasn't like the voices we are used to hearing with carnal ears. It was something that vibrated directly in my soul, an absolute clarity, firm and yet so serene that it eliminated any trace of hesitation that might still remain in me. The voice said, "Run, my daughter. You have already fulfilled what you needed to fulfill in this place. Now your true mission begins." Without looking back, without thinking of the luxury I was leaving behind or the blood that bound me to those people, I began to walk toward the exit of the courtyard with decisive steps. The crowd opened before me as if I were made of a fire even more dangerous than the one that didn't burn me. No one dared to stretch out a hand to touch me or even whisper an insult. I passed them and saw strong men lowering their eyes, women crying uncontrollably, and guards recoiling against the walls, all dominated by a sacred dread that prevented them from acting while I crossed the gates that were once my golden prison, leaving the smell of smoke behind. Upon reaching the main gate of the complex, where the street dust already mixed with the heavy palace air, I saw something that made no logical sense in that context of maximum security and constant surveillance. 3 people I had never seen in my life were standing next to an old, dusty pickup truck. An older man with calloused hands, a woman with red eyes like someone who had spent the night in vigil, and a young man holding the door open with a silent urgency. The young man looked fixedly at me, not with the shock others had, but with the relief of someone finally seeing the result of a promise fulfilled against all odds. He simply said, "Laila, get in now. Jesus sent us to get you." I entered the vehicle without asking a single question, without knowing where we were going or who they were, just feeling that the car was the continuation of the miracle that began at the execution post. The engine started with a dry noise, and we began to pull away, while I saw in the rearview mirror the image of my old life being left behind, shrouded in silence. Inside the pickup truck, the silence was interrupted only by the sound of the engine and the low prayers the man at the wheel murmured non-stop, words of gratitude that seemed to fill the cramped space with peace. The woman beside me, who I later learned was named Sarah, covered my shoulders with a simple wool coat and handed me a bottle of water with a tenderness that made me cry for the first time since everything started. It was ordinary water, but for me, it had the taste of the purest life, going down my throat as I tried to process the fact that I was still breathing after the fire. During the next 15 hours of travel along dirt paths and deserted roads I didn't even know existed, no one asked me for explanations. They simply cared for me, as if I were a precious jewel rescued from a shipwreck. The young man in the front seat looked back every now and then, just to ensure I was still there, with a smile that mixed wonder and an unshakable faith that gave me the strength necessary not to collapse from extreme exhaustion. We arrived at the Jordanian border under a scorching sun that made the sand glow blindingly, and my heart raced again at the sight of the armed checkpoints and soldiers searching every vehicle. I was certain I would be recognized, that photos of the apostate princess would already be at every terminal, and that we would be arrested right there. But what happened was as if a veil had fallen over the eyes of those men. When we stopped at the post, the guard looked directly inside the car, and his eyes passed over me as if I were invisible or just an unimportant shadow in the back seat. He checked the others' documents with strange haste, returned them, and made a dismissive sign for us to move forward without asking a single question about the passenger in scorched clothing. The moment we crossed the borderline and officially entered Jordanian soil, a contained shout of joy exploded inside the car, and I knew I was finally safe in the arms of a new family waiting for me with love. On Jordanian soil, we were taken to a simple house in Amman, far from the suffocating luxury I was used to. The place smelled of fresh bread and mint tea, not expensive incense, and constant fear of shadows. A group of local Christians was waiting for me. There were no cameras, no subjects, just ordinary people with gazes full of a compassion I had never seen in my entire life at court. They hugged me as if I were a sister returning from a long and bloody war, without caring about my dirty clothes or the fact that I was a fugitive. I sat on a worn sofa, feeling the texture of the fabric under my hands, and for the first time in years, I breathed without feeling an enormous weight crushing my lungs every second. It didn't matter that I no longer had my jewels, my titles, or the recognition of my royal lineage. In that small and humble room, surrounded by strangers who were now my spiritual blood, I discovered that true wealth was not kept in the palace vaults, but in the freedom to be able to say the name of Jesus without having to whisper. When they finally left me alone in a small room so I could wash, I walked to the wall mirror with a terrible fear of what I would see reflected there after everything. I was still wearing the same tunic from the day of the execution, now dirty with road dust and with the edges clearly scorched by the fire that roared around me in the palace courtyard. I took off my clothes slowly, my hands shaking violently, expecting to find hidden burn marks, blisters, or at least skin reddened by the unbearable heat I felt in the first few seconds. But what I saw made me fall to my knees on the cold floor and cry like a desperate child. My skin was perfect, smooth and cool to the touch, without a single spot, scar, or wound to prove the horror I lived through before hundreds of people. Only the acrid smell of smoke clinging to my hair served as a physical reminder that all of it had been real and not a dream. Looking at my intact body was like seeing the miracle itself written in my flesh, living proof that God held me. In the following days, while I recovered from the emotional shock, I began to hear the stories of the people surrounding me in that secret network supporting persecuted Christians in the Middle East. Sarah, the woman who welcomed me so tenderly in the car, told me how she had survived a stoning in Damascus just for refusing to deny her new faith before her neighbors. She showed her hands with marks, but her eyes shone with a joy that defied any human logic. I met young people who had been imprisoned and tortured in dark cells, but who spoke of Jesus with a sweetness that made me feel ashamed of my own past weaknesses before the miracle. They shared accounts of silent miracles, of cell doors opening without explanation, and of provisions appearing from nowhere in moments of extreme hunger in the mountains. Hearing those testimonies made me realize that I was not an isolated exception, but part of an immense and invisible family that fire could not extinguish and fear could not silence at all. A week after my miraculous escape, I was taken to a small underground church in Amman to be baptized, the moment that would mark the definitive burial of Princess Laila and the birth of the new creature. The place was simple, with rough stone walls and little light, but to me, it seemed more glorious and sacred than any golden mosque or royal hall in Saudi Arabia I had ever stepped into. When I went down into the waters, I felt a strange and comforting heat run through my entire body, a sensation of deep cleansing that went far beyond the skin, reaching the darkest corners of my soul and memory. Upon emerging from the water, the feeling of weight I had carried since childhood, that obligation to be the perfect daughter of an oppressive system, had completely disappeared from my chest. I no longer had a royal title, I had no inheritance, and I couldn't even use my original last name. But as I was embraced by those brothers and sisters, I knew I had gained an eternal identity. From that day on, I was no longer the fugitive, but a servant of Christ, ready for the mission. With time, the news of what happened in that courtyard began to spread, and I felt I could no longer keep that experience only to myself and the small circle in Amman. I began to share my testimony in smaller meetings, in basements and living rooms, and I saw people crying as they heard about the fire that didn't burn and the Jesus who set me free. Soon, invitations began to come from other countries, and I found myself traveling to places that were previously just names on maps in the palace library, taking with me only a small suitcase and the Bible that had become my compass. It was never out of a search for fame or recognition, for I knew the risk I ran every time I stepped onto a stage or spoke before a cell phone camera. It was to give hope to those who still live with the same paralyzing fear that once consumed me. Every hug I received from a woman who also read the Bible in secret, or from a young man who had been kicked out of his home because of his faith, reminded me that Jesus didn't take me out of those flames just to give me safety, but because there was an urgent mission to be fulfilled in his name. In the middle of this new life of travel and preaching, I received something that shook the structures of my heart, a handwritten letter sent through tortuous and safe paths directly from Saudi Arabia. It was from a cousin of mine, the youngest in the family, who at the time of my execution was only 12 years old and watched everything hidden behind the tunics of the court women. She told me she never forgot the image of me standing in the center of those flames, my face illuminated by a clarity that didn't come from the wood, and that the scene remained engraved in her like a mark that time could not erase. For years, she lived in silence, but now, attending university, she had obtained a Bible through a secret group and was reading the same words that almost cost me my life. Knowing that the seed of the miracle had germinated inside the palace itself, even after my escape and my family's attempt to erase my existence, made me cry for hours. It was the final proof that God was acting where I could no longer reach, transforming the horror of that courtyard into a point of light for those I loved most. But the walk was not made only of miracles of peace. The shadow of persecution continued to follow me, trying to silence the voice that fire could not hush. I suffered real attacks that I often do not share publicly to avoid focusing on fear. But the truth is that divine protection was the only thing that kept me alive during conferences in high-risk countries. I vividly remember an afternoon in Lebanon when I later learned that a sniper's rifle failed at the exact moment he had me in his sights, a mechanical defect impossible to explain technically for a weapon of that precision. On another occasion, we discovered that a car bomb had been positioned on the exact street where I would be staying, but the detonator simply didn't work, as if an invisible hand had held the mechanism at the last second. I don't like to talk about these things as if they were scenes from an action movie, because the fear I felt was real and my hands shook. But these experiences only reinforced my certainty that if I was still here, it was because there were still more people needing to hear that Jesus is real and powerful to save to the uttermost. Today, my routine is very different from that life of a princess surrounded by servants and royal protocols that I had in Saudi Arabia, and I wouldn't trade my current freedom for all the gold in the world. I live in a simple apartment with my husband, Michael, a man who knew my story even before seeing me in person and who decided to dedicate his life to supporting me in this difficult mission. When he asked me to marry him, he didn't promise me wealth or stability, but rather that he would walk by my side wherever Jesus called us, knowing the constant risks my presence brought to his life as well. We have 2 small children who grow up hearing the story of how Mommy was saved from the fire, and seeing faith sprouting in them so naturally is the greatest gift I could receive on this earth. My eldest daughter, Grace, frequently prays for the grandparents she never met, asking with her innocent voice for Jesus to save Grandpa and Grandma's hearts as he saved mine. In those times, I have to look away to hide the tears, feeling a pang of longing for a home that rejected me, but immense peace knowing that now I belong to an eternal family. 7 years have passed since that day in the courtyard, but if I close my eyes now, I can still feel the stifling heat of the air and the nauseating smell of gasoline mixed with dry dust. Many people come to me trying to find a logical explanation, a flaw in the system, or anything that calms their rational minds. But I simply have nothing to say other than what I lived. I was there, tied to that rough wooden post, feeling the ropes cut my wrists, and I saw the fire rise with a roar that seemed to come from hell itself. The heat was unbearable for a second, and then, in the blink of an eye, everything shifted to a state that science cannot catalog. It wasn't just an absence of pain. It was the presence of something so dense and real that the fire seemed to have become just an image without power. I can describe every detail of that moment, the shock on the guards' faces and the silence of the crowd. But explaining the how is something that escapes my human capacity to this day. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up with my heart racing, feeling that smell of smoke impregnated in my nostrils, even being in a safe room with my children sleeping beside me. The trauma of being condemned to death by one's own father doesn't disappear with a snap of the fingers, and there are days when the weight of that rejection hurts more than any physical fire could. To deal with these moments of emotional darkness, I go back to my small prayer corner and open the Bible Michael gave me, an identical copy to the one I hid under the bed in the royal palace. When I run my fingers over those pages, it's as if I go back to that Ramadan dawn, holding the cell phone light with trembling hands, but now without the fear of being discovered at any second. Transforming this pain into mission was the only way I found not to lose myself in resentment against those who wanted to destroy me. Every word I read now out loud, without needing to whisper, is a constant reminder that the freedom I received cost a great deal, but that it is the most valuable treasure a human being can possess on this earth. What consumes my heart most nowadays is not the risk I run, but knowing that while I speak here with all this freedom, there are thousands of women and men living exactly as I lived, in absolute silence and paralyzing fear. People who believe that loving Jesus is an unpardonable crime, who hide scraps of paper with verses written by hand inside their shoes or under the pillow, fearing their own blood will denounce them to the authorities. It is for these lives that I continue stepping onto stages and recording these videos, even knowing that my head still has a price and that there are people hunting me around the world. I know what it feels like to think the ceiling is falling on you and that God seems like a distant judge ready to crush you. When I talk about my story, I don't want people to see a spectacular miracle to be applauded, but to understand that the same Jesus who took me out of the fire is the one who whispers, "You are mine," in the middle of their room's darkness. This invisible connection between those who suffer for the sake of truth is what gives me the strength not to stop, even when physical exhaustion tries to knock me down. A lot of people try to seek complex psychological explanations, speaking of collective hysteria or some kind of mystical trance that affected everyone present in the courtyard that day. They say perhaps the oil wasn't well mixed, or that there was some rare climatic phenomenon that muffled the flames for a few crucial moments. But I just listen and smile in silence, without feeling the slightest need to prove anything. If someone wants to believe it was a trick, fine. That doesn't change the fact that my clothes were scorched and my ropes turned to ashes while my skin remained perfectly intact. The peace I carry today doesn't depend on convincing the skeptics, but on the internal certainty that I saw the eyes of Jesus and felt his hand sustaining me when the whole world told me I was cursed. I lost my title as a princess and the chance to see my parents grow old, but in exchange, I gained something that no royal decree can revoke. Today I am just Laila, an ordinary woman who discovered that the creator of the universe calls her daughter, and that identity is more than enough to fill any void the past left. Sometimes, sitting on the balcony of my simple apartment, watching the common movement of people in the street, I feel a sudden chill that brings me back, in the blink of an eye, to that hot marble courtyard in Arabia. It's not a paralyzing fear, but a sensory reminder that the reality we see is just a thin film over something much deeper and more powerful than we imagine. I look at my hands now, holding a mug of coffee, and I'm still surprised not to find the scars that logic says should be there, marking my skin forever after contact with the flames. On that day, when the fire rose and the light enveloped me, the princess who lived among silks and protocols truly died, and the woman born from those ashes no longer needs crowns or human approval to feel worthy. Life follows its normal course, with bills to pay and trivial worries. But that invisible and spiritual mark is here, pulsing in the center of my chest as a constant reminder that I am not the master of my own destiny. I don't consider myself someone special. I am just an ordinary person who, in a moment of absolute despair, cried out for help and was heard in a way that defies every law of biology and physics we know. The silence that followed that day, both from God and from the people who witnessed the event, is something that still impresses me and makes me reflect deeply every night before I sleep. There were no more voices echoing from the sky, no more magnificent appearances or bright lights appearing in the middle of my living room to guide me in the years to come. It was a unique and isolated event, a giant question mark driven into the history of my lineage and those hundreds of witnesses who observed everything without breathing. Many of my relatives and guards who were there in that courtyard fell silent forever, choosing the path of forced forgetting and pretending nothing happened so as not to lose their positions of prestige and power in the kingdom. But I know, I feel it in the depths of my soul, that in the dark of their luxurious rooms, they still close their eyes and see that impossible light that swallowed the fire and returned life to me before them. I live with this silent certainty, without trying to force anyone to be convinced. I simply report the facts as they occurred. The miracle didn't happen to transform me into a mystical figure, but rather to make me truly free from the chains of fear. Today, when I observe my children playing on the living room rug, I see in them the future that was returned to me in a completely inexplicable way by hands that do not belong to this material world. They have no idea what the suffocating smell of burning diesel oil is or the metallic sound of chains closing around wrists, and my daily prayer is that they never need to go through anything resembling that. But at the same time, they know with impressive clarity that their mother was rescued and loved by someone who is infinitely stronger than the hottest fire in the desert. This is the only and true inheritance I can leave them. There are no titles of nobility, no vast properties or family jewels, only an account that sounds like complete madness to the skeptics, but which is the solid foundation of everything I am and believe today. If I could go back in time and face it all again, the cold cells and the unjust judgment, my answer would be an absolute yes, without any hesitation. That single second of meeting face to face with the presence of Jesus in the middle of that furnace was worth much more than all the decades of empty luxury and lies I lived before. The experience simply ceased, as abruptly and mysteriously as it began, leaving a void of explanations that accompanies me to the present moment as I write these words. The indescribable light vanished suddenly, the heat returned to being just the scorching desert sun over the courtyard, and I had to use my own legs, still trembling, to walk away from the death that seemed certain. To this day, when I visit doctors for routine reasons, or when I see documentaries about survivors of devastating fires, I realize that there is no gap in human logic for what happened to me. The immutable laws of nature were suspended for a few crucial minutes and then returned to normal functioning, as if nothing had occurred in that geographic space. I carry this gap in reason with me, this deep mystery that no one, not even the wisest of men, can fill with words or scientific theories. I was there, I felt the fire, and at the same time, I was preserved by something that is far beyond our finite understanding of the universe. It is with this permanent mark on the soul, with this total inability to explain the phenomenon logically, that I continue living each day, grateful for the silence that remained after the miracle.
Layla's story leaves us with a profound question. What would you be willing to sacrifice for your faith when everything seems lost? Your opinion is fundamental to us. Share what you felt or your own experience in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell right now. It is the only way to ensure you don't miss this content that transforms lives and strengthens the soul. Now, don't stop here. Click on the video appearing on the screen to continue this journey of faith. Thank you very much. Stay with God, and until the next video.